She spent an hour getting ready for that dinner. An hour choosing the dress, an hour fixing her hair, an hour convincing herself she looked beautiful. And when she walked into that restaurant, her husband laughed at the joke his friends made about her. He didn't defend her. He didn't even flinch. He just laughed. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the woman he was humiliating was fighting a war inside her own body that would soon make every single one of them regret what they had done. Stay with this story until the end, because what happens to her next will change the way you see every person you've ever judged from the outside. Her name was Grace. She was 31 years old, she worked as a school counselor, and she had spent her whole life being told, in one way or another, that she needed to be smaller to be worthy of love. Smaller in her opinions. Smaller in her body. Smaller in the space she took up in a room. The man she married was named Marcus. He was 34, successful, charming, the kind of man who could walk into any room and make people feel like the conversation had finally gotten interesting. When Grace met him, she couldn't understand what he saw in her. He was polished. She was ordinary. But he chose her, again and again, in the early days, and for a while, that felt like enough. This is her story. Stay with me, because it's about to change. Grace grew up the youngest of 3 sisters in a house where dinner table conversations often circled back to appearance. Her mother meant well, she always said so, but meaning well and doing well are 2 very different things. "You have such a pretty face," her mother would say, in a tone that made the sentence feel like it was missing a but. Grace grew up believing her body was a problem to be solved, not a home to be lived in. She was good at many things. She was good at listening to teenagers who felt invisible and making them feel seen. She was good at painting, though she rarely showed anyone her work. She was good at loving people fiercely and without condition, the kind of love that shows up with soup when you're sick and remembers your worst day 3 years later and asks how you're really doing. But none of that seemed to matter in a world that kept handing her a measuring tape instead of a mirror. When she met Marcus at a friend's engagement party, something in her allowed itself to hope. He sought her out. He asked her real questions and actually waited for the answers. On their 3rd date, sitting across from her in a dim little Italian restaurant, he said the words that would live in her chest for years afterward. "You're perfect exactly the way you are." She wanted so badly to believe him. And for a long time, she did. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. Grace remembers that proposal more clearly than she remembers her own wedding day. Marcus, nervous for once in his confident life, getting down on one knee in the park where they'd had their first real conversation, his voice shaking as he asked her to be his wife. She said yes before he even finished the sentence. The first 2 years of their marriage were, by any measure, happy. Marcus came home with flowers for no reason at all. They cooked dinner together on Sunday nights, bumping shoulders at the stove, arguing playfully over how much garlic was too much garlic. They stayed up late watching old movies, Grace's head on his chest, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her arm. She believed, with the kind of certainty that only comes before you've been proven wrong, that she had finally found someone who would never make her feel small. She was wrong. Not about him loving her, not at first. She was wrong about how long that love could survive contact with the world's opinion of her. It started small, the way most painful things do. Marcus began going to the gym every morning before work. Nothing unusual there, plenty of people start new routines. But soon the gym mornings came with commentary. A comment about the size of her plate at dinner. A comment about how she used to be so active. A comment, delivered with a laugh so it wouldn't sound like what it actually was, about how she should probably ease up on dessert. Grace laughed it off in the beginning too. She told herself he was just looking out for her, that this was what a caring partner did. She told herself this so many times that for a while, she almost believed it. But comments have a way of multiplying. What starts as one sentence becomes a daily habit, and a daily habit becomes the water you're swimming in without even noticing you're drowning. You should really stop eating that. You're getting bigger. You need to take better care of yourself. Each sentence felt like a small paper cut. Not enough to draw real blood on its own. But paper cuts add up. And Grace was collecting them one by one, every single day, without anyone, including herself, realizing how deep the wound had actually become. She started eating dinner faster, before he could comment. She started declining desserts at other people's houses so she wouldn't have to hear about it in the car afterward. She started avoiding mirrors, not because she disliked what she saw, but because she'd trained herself to see her body as evidence in a case that was constantly being built against her. And still, she stayed. Still, she told herself this was a phase, a rough patch, the kind of thing every long-term relationship goes through. Still, she loved him, in the complicated and stubborn way people love the person they chose before things changed. Then came the dinner. It was a work event for one of Marcus's colleagues, held at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place with candlelight and a menu that didn't list prices. Grace had spent nearly an hour getting ready. She'd chosen a black dress that made her feel, for the first time in months, something close to pretty. She did her hair. She put on the earrings Marcus had given her for their second anniversary. She looked in the mirror and, just for a moment, let herself feel good when they walked into the restaurant, heads turned, not in admiration, but the way heads turn when people are deciding what to whisper about. One of Marcus's colleagues leaned over to another and said something Grace couldn't quite hear. But she didn't need to hear the words. She understood the language of a room laughing at her before she'd even sat down. She'd understood that language her whole life. She looked at Marcus, waiting, hoping, for him to do what a partner is supposed to do in that moment. To put a hand on her back. To meet the joke with silence, or better, with a pointed comment of his own that made it clear this behavior wasn't welcome. To simply not laugh. He laughed. Not a loud laugh. Not a cruel one, if you were being generous about it. But a laugh all the same, quiet and complicit, the kind of laugh that tells everyone in the room exactly whose side you've chosen. And in that moment, something inside Grace, something that had been cracking quietly for months, finally gave way. She sat through the rest of the dinner in a fog. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She answered questions when she was asked. But she wasn't really there. Part of her had already left that restaurant and gone somewhere far away, somewhere Marcus's laugh couldn't follow her. The car ride home was silent. Grace stared out the window, watching streetlights blur past, replaying the sound of that laugh over and over. Finally, unable to hold it in any longer, she asked the question that had been building in her chest since the moment they walked out of the restaurant. "Why didn't you say anything?" Marcus sighed, the exhausted sigh of a man who felt he was being unfairly accused of something. "Grace, you need to stop being so sensitive. They were laughing at me. They were joking. It wasn't funny." He glanced at her, and for a second, Grace thought she saw something like guilt flicker across his face. But it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by something colder. "Maybe if you lost some weight, people wouldn't have anything to joke about." The words landed like a slap. Grace didn't cry, not in that car, not in front of him. She had learned a long time ago how to hold her tears until she was alone. But she carried those words with her that night, and the next morning, and every morning after that. They became a kind of background noise in her mind, a voice that echoed his voice, telling her she was the problem, that she was the reason people laughed, that her body was something to apologize for. In the months that followed, Grace tried everything. She overhauled her diet, cutting out foods she'd loved her entire life. She started running before work, dragging herself out of bed at 5 in the morning even when every part of her wanted to stay under the covers. She stood in front of the mirror each day, not to admire herself but to inspect herself, cataloging every part of her body that she believed had failed her. But something strange kept happening. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how disciplined she was, her body wouldn't respond the way it was supposed to. She was exhausted all the time, not the normal tiredness of a demanding schedule, but a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. Her hands trembled sometimes for no reason. She'd catch herself out of breath climbing the stairs she used to climb without thinking twice. And still, despite everything, the number on the scale barely moved. She didn't know it yet, but her body wasn't failing her. It was trying to tell her something, and no one, not her doctor, not her husband, not even Grace herself, was listening closely enough to hear it. Marcus noticed her exhaustion, but not in the way a caring partner notices. He noticed it the way you notice something isn't working the way you paid for it to work. "You're not even trying anymore," he told her one evening, watching her collapse onto the couch after a run that had left her lightheaded and shaking. "I am trying," she said, too tired to argue with any real force. "I'm trying harder than I've ever tried at anything." He didn't answer. He just looked at her the way you look at a problem you've decided isn't worth solving anymore. Grace didn't know it then, but that look was the beginning of the end. 3 weeks later, she came home from a long day at work to find Marcus sitting at the kitchen table, a folder in front of him. She knew before she even sat down. There's a particular stillness in a house on the day everything changes, and Grace had walked into that stillness the moment she opened the door. "What is this?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. "I think we need to end our marriage," Marcus said. Her hands began to tremble, not from exhaustion this time, but from something colder, something that felt like the floor giving way beneath her. "Why?" Marcus wouldn't meet her eyes. "We've grown apart." Grace knew that wasn't the truth. She had felt the truth building for over a year, in every comment, every laugh, every silence when she needed him to speak up. But she needed to hear him say it. She needed him to be honest, just once, even if the honesty destroyed her. "Is it because of my weight?" Marcus said nothing. And in a marriage, silence can be the loudest answer of all. Grace's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. "You promised you would love me no matter what." "I know," he said quietly. "You said I was perfect exactly the way I am." "I know." "Then what changed?" Marcus finally looked up, and when he spoke, his words landed with a finality that Grace would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You changed." Those 2 words undid something in her that months of comments and one cruel laugh in a crowded restaurant had only begun to crack. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the man she had built a life with, searching his face for some trace of the person who had once told her she was perfect. She couldn't find him. She didn't scream. She didn't beg him to reconsider. Some part of her, the same part that had been quietly leaving the restaurant that night while her body stayed behind and smiled, had already made peace with what was coming. She picked up the pen, and with a hand that had finally stopped shaking, she signed the papers. She packed one suitcase. She didn't take much, some clothes, a few books, the small jewelry box her grandmother had left her. She walked past Marcus without another word, opened the front door, and stepped outside into a life she hadn't chosen but was about to have to build anyway. Marcus watched her go from the kitchen window, and in that moment, he believed, with the particular confidence of a man who has never had to face real consequences, that he had made the right decision. He had no idea what Grace was about to discover about her own body, a discovery that would explain everything, that would prove every cruel comment, every laugh, every accusation wrong in ways he could never have imagined. He had no idea that the woman he had just called changed was about to change in ways that would make him understand, far too late, exactly what he had thrown away. And somewhere in a small apartment across town, in the days that followed, Grace was about to walk into a doctor's office for a routine checkup that would turn her entire understanding of herself, and her entire future, upside down. What she was about to learn wasn't just about her body. It was about to become the thing that finally set her free. Grace sat alone in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and old magazines, staring at a form she'd already filled out 3 times, and had no idea that the next 20 minutes would explain every single thing she had blamed herself for over the past 2 years. She thought she was there because she was tired. She had no idea she was about to learn she'd been fighting a war her whole body had been losing in silence. Stay with her, because what the doctor is about to say is going to change everything you think you understand about this story. The apartment Grace moved into after leaving Marcus was small, one bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a window that looked out onto a brick wall instead of a view. But it was hers. For the first time in years, every decision made inside those four walls belonged to her and no one else. There was no one to comment on what she ate for dinner. No one to sigh when she reached for a second helping. No one to remind her, in ways big and small, that her body was a problem waiting to be solved. And yet, she wasn't getting better. If anything, she was getting worse. The exhaustion that had plagued her in the final months of her marriage hadn't disappeared with Marcus. It had deepened. Some mornings she woke up feeling like she hadn't slept at all, her limbs heavy in a way that had nothing to do with how many hours she'd spent in bed. She found herself needing to sit down halfway through grocery shopping, gripping the edge of a shelf while her heart pounded strangely in her chest. She told herself it was stress. She told herself it was grief. She told herself a lot of things, because the alternative, admitting that something might actually be wrong with her body, after years of being told the problem was her lack of discipline, felt unbearable. It was her sister, Olivia, who finally pushed her to see a doctor. Olivia had noticed the changes before Grace was willing to say them out loud. The way Grace's hands trembled slightly when she held a cup of coffee. The way she'd go pale and breathless just walking up a single flight of stairs. The dark circles that no amount of concealer could fully hide. Olivia had watched her younger sister shrink into herself for 2 years of marriage, and she wasn't about to watch her disappear entirely now that she was finally free. "You're not okay, Grace," Olivia said one evening, sitting across from her at that small kitchen table. "And I don't mean because of the divorce. Something is wrong with your body, and I think you already know it." Grace wanted to argue. She wanted to say she was fine, that she was just adjusting, that everyone feels tired after a divorce. But something in her sister's face, the fear behind the concern, made the words die in her throat. Maybe because some quiet, exhausted part of her had been waiting for permission to admit the truth for a long time. She made the appointment the next morning. Dr. Patel was not the kind of physician who rushed through appointments. She was patient, and more importantly, she was thorough, the kind of doctor who asked follow-up questions instead of nodding along and reaching for a prescription pad. When Grace described her symptoms, the exhaustion, the trembling hands, the breathlessness, the stubborn weight that refused to respond to any amount of effort, Dr. Patel didn't dismiss any of it. She didn't tell Grace to simply eat less and move more. Instead, she ordered a full panel of blood work, and asked Grace to come back in a week. That week felt endless. Grace went through the motions of her days: work, groceries, the slow process of making a new apartment feel like a home, but underneath it all was a current of quiet dread she couldn't name. Some part of her had spent so long believing her body was the enemy that she almost expected the results to confirm it. She braced herself for another lecture about willpower. She was not prepared for what Dr. Patel actually told her. "Grace," the doctor said, sliding a folder across the desk between them, "your thyroid levels are severely abnormal. You have a condition that's been affecting your hormones for what looks like a long time, possibly years. This explains the fatigue, the weight changes, the trembling, all of it. Your body hasn't been failing to respond to your effort. It's been fighting a battle that made your effort almost impossible to win." Grace stared at the folder without seeing it. Years. This had been happening for years, through the early days of her marriage when Marcus told her she was perfect, through the months when his comments turned cruel, through every morning she stood in front of the mirror cataloging her own body like evidence in a trial. This whole time, there had been a real, physical explanation, invisible to everyone, including her. "I wasn't lazy," she said quietly, almost to herself. Dr. Patel's expression softened. "No. You weren't lazy. You were sick, and nobody, including you, was able to see it." There should have been relief in that moment. And there was, somewhere underneath everything else, a small, quiet vindication for every accusation she'd swallowed, every apology she'd offered for a body that had never actually betrayed her the way she'd been told it had. But relief wasn't the only thing Grace felt sitting in that office. There was grief, too. Grief for the version of herself who had spent 2 years believing she was the problem. Grief for all the mornings she'd woken up and immediately begun apologizing to her own reflection. But Dr. Patel wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said, and something in her tone made Grace's stomach tighten. "Your recent test results show some irregularities in your heart rhythm. Given your symptoms, the breathlessness, the episodes of dizziness, I want to run some additional cardiac testing right away. I don't want to alarm you, but this isn't something we can wait on." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Grace had walked in expecting, at worst, some difficult diet changes and a new prescription. She had not expected the word cardiac. She had not expected to hear, in the space of a single appointment, that her body had not only been fighting a hormonal war for years, but was now facing something that could genuinely threaten her life. The cardiac testing was scheduled for the following week, and it was, without question, the longest week of Grace's life. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, running through every dismissed symptom, every time she told herself she was simply out of shape, every moment she had blamed her own body instead of listening to what it had been trying to tell her. When the results came back, they confirmed what Dr. Patel had suspected. Grace had developed a heart condition, one connected to the same hormonal imbalance that had gone untreated for years, compounding silently in the background of a life that had been consumed by criticism she didn't deserve. It was serious. It was treatable, if caught in time, but it was serious. "We caught this early enough to manage it well," Dr. Patel told her, "but if you'd gone another year without treatment, we might be having a very different conversation." Grace left that appointment with a treatment plan, a prescription, and a strange, fragile clarity she hadn't expected. Somewhere between the fear and the grief, something else was beginning to take root, something that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of self-forgiveness. Because here was the truth Grace was finally allowing herself to see. She had spent years being told, by the person who was supposed to love her most, that her body was a personal failure. That her exhaustion was laziness. That her weight was evidence of some deficiency in her willpower or her character. And the entire time, her body had been quietly, desperately fighting to survive a condition no amount of willpower could have fixed. She began treatment immediately, medication to regulate the hormonal imbalance, careful monitoring for her heart, a slower and more compassionate relationship with food and exercise than she had ever allowed herself before. It wasn't a quick fix. Some days the fatigue still pulled at her like an undertow, and some days her heart still fluttered strangely in her chest, reminding her how close she had come to something far worse. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace wasn't fighting her own body. She was working with it. And slowly, something inside her that had been silent for years began, cautiously, to speak up again. She started small. She returned to painting, something she hadn't touched since the early days of her marriage, when Marcus had once commented that her studio corner took up too much space in their apartment. She bought a set of watercolors and filled an entire notebook with clumsy, imperfect paintings of things that had nothing to do with anyone's approval: the brick wall outside her window, her sister's hands, the particular blue of a sky she'd noticed on her walk to work. She also, at Olivia's gentle suggestion, joined a support group, a small circle of women who met on Thursday evenings in the back room of a community center, women who had each, in their own ways, been made to feel that their bodies disqualified them from love or respect or basic human dignity. Grace was terrified the first time she walked into that room. She sat in the back, saying almost nothing for the first 2 meetings, listening to other women describe experiences that felt uncomfortably, achingly familiar. But by the 3rd meeting, something shifted. A woman named Priya shared a story about a boss who had commented on her weight during a performance review, as though it were relevant to her competence at her job. And Grace, without entirely planning to, found herself speaking, haltingly at first, then with more certainty, about a man who had once told her she was perfect, and then spent 2 years making her believe the opposite was true. The room didn't laugh. Nobody whispered. A few women nodded, recognizing themselves in her story the way she had recognized herself in Priya's. For the first time in longer than Grace could remember, her body wasn't the subject of a joke. It was simply the place she lived, surrounded by people who understood exactly what it had cost her to keep living there. She began going every week. She began speaking more, and eventually, she began listening in a different way too, not for the criticism she'd trained herself to expect, but for the quiet solidarity of women who had survived their own versions of the same story. Meanwhile, word of what had happened to Grace was beginning to travel, the way news does in circles of mutual friends, passed along in half-finished sentences and careful pauses. Someone mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone who happened to still be in touch with Marcus. Marcus heard the news on an ordinary Tuesday evening, from a friend who delivered it carefully, almost apologetically, over a beer neither of them finished. He heard that Grace had been sick, genuinely, seriously sick, for longer than either of them had known. He heard about the thyroid condition. He heard about the heart. He heard that she had nearly waited too long to get help, and that if she had, the story might have ended very differently. He sat with that information for a long time after his friend left, staring at nothing in particular, replaying moments he had spent 2 years not examining too closely. The mornings she'd been too exhausted to get out of bed, and he'd assumed laziness. The dinner parties where she'd needed to sit down early, and he'd assumed she was simply out of shape. The night in the restaurant, the joke, the laugh he still hadn't fully forgiven himself for. He thought about the words he'd said to her in the car that night, maybe if you lost some weight, people wouldn't have anything to joke about, and for the first time, he let himself feel the full, sickening weight of what those words might have actually meant, coming from a man who had no idea what her body had actually been carrying. He thought about the words he'd said across that kitchen table, the ones he could never take back. You changed. He had meant them as an accusation. He was beginning to understand they might have been the truest thing he'd ever said to her, just not in the way he'd intended. Marcus sat alone in his apartment that night, staring at his phone, Grace's contact information still saved under a nickname he hadn't used in months. He didn't call. Not that night. He wasn't ready, and some part of him understood, with a clarity that felt uncomfortably like growth, that he didn't have the right to interrupt whatever healing she had managed to build without him. But he couldn't stop thinking about her. He couldn't stop replaying 2 years of moments through a new, unbearable lens, a lens that showed him exactly how much damage a person can do without ever raising their voice, simply by choosing, again and again, not to protect the person they claimed to love. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to make a decision that would bring him face to face with the woman he had once called changed, and this time, he would be the one who had truly changed, whether Grace was ready to see it or not. And what Grace was about to do with that second chance, whether she would open the door to the man who had once laughed while she was humiliated, or close it forever and keep walking toward the life she was finally building for herself, was about to become the most important choice of her entire story. Because healing, Grace was learning, isn't just about surviving what broke you. It's about deciding, with open eyes, exactly who deserves to witness who you become next.